Um, and to the interns, our various listeners here, I'm Larry Nagengast. I've spent 28 years as a reporter and editor at the News Journal in Delaware, and I spent much of the past 20 years as a freelance writer, doing everything from breaking news to lengthy reports, and even wrote a book and edited a couple others along the way. So that's kind of my background. With me today, Tom Linthicum, who's been a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a reporter and editor at the Baltimore Sun, adjunct professor of journalism at University of Maryland, and he is currently president of the Board of Trustees of the MDDC Press Foundation. Also, Andy West, executive editor of Delaware State News, and he has spent the last 30 years as an editor with the State News and its sister publications. Before that, he worked briefly with USA Today and with several other dailies in both New York State and Pennsylvania. What we're going to do here, I'm going to first turn it over to Tom, and then Andy, then come back to me, and then after that, we'll have some time for questions. And I'm hoping from our audience that we give you enough helpful information that you'll be able to frame your questions to us even better than you might have thought possible. So with that, Tom, all yours.
Thanks, Larry, very much. Appreciate that. And thanks for all of you for being here. It's good to see several of the interns that I know that I'm getting to know. Welcome. Good to see you. And it's good to see an old colleague like Jim Gutman. So thanks for being here, Jim. So here we go into interviewing. And I can imagine where some of you, certainly it sounds like some of you have a fair amount of experience already in interviewing, but some of you may also be thinking, so is this really worth talking about that much? I mean, interviewing, how tough can that be? Well, that means you talk to people. It means you have conversations. They say something, you say something. We all do that every day, all the time. So how hard can it be? I'm going to suggest to you that if you haven't already discovered this, interviewing as a journalist is deceptively difficult. And I say that because yes, it's a familiar way of communication. Yes, we all do it in one form or another. But there is something about being a journalist, which puts you in a different situation often. Your situation in an interview might be adversarial. It might be a case where the other person doesn't know you at all, and so you've got to try to build trust on the fly, as Crystal was talking about. It may also be that the person you're interviewing doesn't really want to talk to you, or doesn't want to talk to you what you're asking about. They've got other talking points and an agenda they're supposed to get across for them or their organization. And so you're going kind of like this with your questions and answers. So those are some of the things that make interviewing as a journalist really a very challenging thing. And let me start by saying something that you might find somewhat counterintuitive, and it's this. The single most important thing you do in an interview as a journalist is not to talk, but to listen, and to listen very, very carefully. And we'll talk about some techniques about how you do that and why you do that. But if you're always, well, let me back up for a second. As a teacher, for years, I stressed to my students, for interviewing, always be sure that you have your list of questions. It's got to be a comprehensive list before, and you can check off the topics as you go through. What I found as my students turned in the stories was that they tended to have holes in them, gaps in them. And they would say things like, so-and-so has a keen sense of humor, period, paragraph. Okay, I got a personal fact in the story. Now I'm going to move on. So-and-so came to a defining moment in his or her life when they decided to do this rather than that, whatever. But there was often very little follow-up with more detail about why did that happen? How did that happen? What was the driving force that made that happen? And therein lies the real gold that you can get from an interview. So I began to realize that really the problem was with a lot of my students, they weren't asking follow-up questions, or if they were, they weren't very good follow-up questions. And that's when became clear to me that we needed to spend more time on that and more time on listening. Because if you're focused on the next question, which may be on an entirely different subject of the one you just asked, if you're focusing on that question and exactly how you want to frame that, that means you can't possibly be listening carefully to the answer you're getting to the question you just asked, which might demand a follow-up question. But unless you are carefully listening and sifting that material and asking yourself some questions about it, you're probably not going to ask a follow-up question, or at least it won't be a very effective follow-up question. Follow-up questions can be open-ended or closed-ended. Closed-ended are the simple ones that need to be addressed right away, but how old were you when that happened? Where were you living? What was your first job? Really narrowly focused, discernible, easily answered things. Or they can be more general, like when I talked earlier about so-and-so has a good sense of humor, or so-and-so is a workaholic, or whatever. So you might ask more open-ended follow-up questions like, what exactly do you mean by that? Or can you give me an example of that? Or sometimes just as open as, can you say some more about that? Just to try to get the person to add a little flesh, add some details to it. And then you can also fall back on my 3-year-old granddaughter's favorite question: why, Granddad, why? You'd be surprised how effective that 3-letter word as a question can be sometimes. There's a technique you can use also called reflective listening that I'll tell you about briefly. And Crystal, it's a tool that you can use in building trust also. And that is, you're testing for understanding. You're trying to do 2 things. You're testing for understanding, and you're sending a message to the subject of your interview that you're really listening. You're really listening carefully, and you're trying hard to get this. So you bring your, you wait for a pause, or sometimes you have to create the pause in an interview, and then you say something like, I really want to be sure that I'm getting your point right. I'm understanding your point right, because I realize this is going to be very important to my readers. Is it accurate to say that? And then you paraphrase the key point that the person has just made. And that's going to send several messages. Number one, you're just going to test did you get it right? But it's telling the interviewer that you're really trying hard to get this, that you are well-intentioned, that you are a conscientious interviewer. You're just not trying to get the sexy soundbite and then move on. You're really trying to understand the point that's being made. And that's also a great, particularly if your person doesn't know you, that's a very strong signal that you can trust me on this, because I'm trying really hard to get it and to make sure that my readers get it. Okay, so moving on. Also, it's very important if in your listening to listen just as carefully to what is being said as to what is not being said. Because people may be giving you the answer that they want to give you. They may be giving you the answer that they have right in front of them in some pre-programmed talking points, but that's not necessarily the question that you asked, or it may be answering just part of the question that you asked. And let me give you a couple of examples about that. One is what somebody called years ago, the lie of the technical truth. I forgot who said it, but I remember the phrase because I just love it. It's such a vivid phrase. And what that means is, the statement is being made like there was a Chipotle, you may remember years ago, was having all sorts of trouble with being shut down because of complaints about the quality of food and food poisoning and whatever. And and I don't mean to pick on them, it just happened to them. It's happened to other companies too, but they would issue statements saying something like, it is our policy to serve only the freshest and purest ingredients to all of our customers because their health and safety is foremost in our concern, or something like that. And it was wonderful. It was very high sounding. It was very noble and was whatever. but it didn't address the issue of, well, particularly if that's your policy, then how could this have happened? Because all these people did get sick. What steps are you taking to new steps, additional steps are you taking in the future? So you had to ask a series of follow-up questions to really get at the essence of the answer that was going to be meaningful to your readers. Another one is the what I'll call the non-denial denial. Same principle. There was a perfect example of this yesterday. You might have seen the story. The Washington Post got a hold of an email from the top lawyer to the Republican National Committee during the election, who wrote a colleague that the lawsuits being filed by some of the Trump allied lawyers to try to overturn the elections were, quote, just a joke, unquote. Well, of course, everyone then wanted a reaction from him and whatever. So he issued a very strong statement saying something to the effect of, anyone who would suggest that I did not fully support the president and do everything in my power to help his reelection is not telling the truth. All right, well, 3 cheers for you. That's very good. That's not what the story said. That wasn't the point. The point is, did you write this thing? And then he went on in the statement to, in effect, say, yes, I did write that, and I did think those lawsuits were somewhat of a joke. But the non-denial denial. So what's being denied? Is it on point? Is it what you're accused of, or is it just something else that's to try to sound good and throw off the reader? And the last thing I'll leave with you is don't be afraid to use silence as a tactic in your interviewing. It can be very effective. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, who knows? But there's a human impulse, even among some experienced people, there's a human impulse to fill in the gap, and that it usually, particularly if you as the interviewer know what you're doing and why you're doing it, pressure's not mounting on you, it's mounting on the person that you're interviewing. And sometimes they will step forward to try to fill that space and say some pretty interesting and revealing things. So keep that in your toolbox as well. A lot more we could talk about, but we got a lot of questions, and Andy's up next. And so I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Andy.
Well, thank you, Tom. That's pretty hard to follow. I'm going to review a couple of things that you said, though. I think that, listening was one of the points on my list that I think is just extremely critical. The doing your homework, I think, is the other that I think is essential in this. I recommend 10 to 12 questions on your list, and make sure that you just don't read one after the other. Really listen to those answers. And some of your 10 to 12 questions may be details, spelling the name, a little bit of background that maybe wasn't available to you in a bio sheet or a Google search, those kind of things. When there's 2 different types of interviewing that most reporters are going to do from day to day. One is the basic news interview. You're at a meeting, you're at an event, you're at a breaking news story. And those are different types of interviews where you've got to be quick, thoughtful, understand the context of the news that you're about to report so that you're asking questions specific to that. And then the other would be the profile or the in-depth feature, which I really enjoy doing myself. And I think over the years, all of us are probably most proud of those clips because that's your chance to really get to know somebody. And in that, one of the greatest, there's 2 bits of advice that I had gotten over the years about the in-depth interview that I really appreciated. My intention was to be a sports writer. It turned out that there's not enough money in sports writing right out of college to pay the bills. So some things changed along the way quickly. But if I had a choice, I'd go back and do it again. But one of those bits of advice that I took in was from the Washington Post baseball writer, Tom Boswell. And Tom would say, if you were approaching an athlete wanting to do a feature story, one of the things to keep in mind is ask them questions about their craft. How do they do it? How's that baseball pitcher grip their fastball? How do they, hold it bad? What's their stance? Those things. It gets them to talk about the things that they're most passionate about right away, and they know that you're interested. And I think that's one of the ones that's really important, and I think that opens doors in pretty much every interview that you'll ever do. The other is make observations. I should probably start by saying this. Right now, the most critical thing that any of us can do is talk to people in person, eye to eye. And that means visiting their office, visiting their place where they're doing whatever their hobby is. Even if it's meeting them for a cup of coffee somewhere, meet in person, look people in the eye. They'll know that you're more genuine. They'll know that you're putting in the effort. And the other is, if you meet them in their environment, look at the mementos that are around them. Right now, I'm looking at Tom and Larry's workspaces, and I can, pick up little hints. I'm going to look at the gifts that have been given to them that they cherish on their shelves, the books that they're reading, the photos that are on their wall. Those are things that are icebreakers. And you can look behind me and see certain things in my office at home. But these are ways that you can connect with people, and where you say, "Tell me more about this photo. This looks like you when you were much younger." Those things, and it gets people to warm up to you. And that's probably true most situations in life, and just meeting people in general and getting to know them. So I think those are, important things. The beginning part of my career was as an obituary at the News Journal of Wilmington. Best year and a half I spent of my career. Hated it. I hated the job. To go in every day knowing that I was going to write 20 obits, take these phone calls from funeral homes, having to call the families. But the important thing was that it was detail oriented, and you had to get it right. So your questions had to be specific. Your note taking had to be good. When you were talking to family, you had to have empathy for them, that ability to be quiet while they compose themselves, that ability to listen to their stories. All of those things have played into how I approach things now. And anytime that you're talking with somebody, you don't understand something, ask them to clarify it. I think those are really important things for you. So the hardest part of this, and it's sort of part two, perhaps, of this thing of interviewing, is the note taking. Note taking is probably the most challenging thing you can do as a journalist. And when you're interviewing, I still fall back on a recorder often in my stories that I do that have more depth to them, because I want to be able to converse more freely with that person I'm talking to. And the quotes tend to be better that way. I can capture some of the manner in which they speak, those kind of things. If I'm on a news assignment, which I don't do very often anymore, I don't like to use the tape recorder there. It's about getting the facts down, taking care of your notes very quickly, asking those specific questions. So keep those things in mind. So I could go on, but I probably would tell you that the bit of advice I would give to you going into any interviews: be curious. That's the thing that's missing from most journalists today, is curiosity. Be curious. Be kind, be courteous, be open-minded, be professional. So I'll leave you with those things, and certainly happy to have conversation, which is really what interviewing is about.
Well, thank you much, Andy. I guess, okay, it's my turn. And quite frankly, I'm going to overlap a little bit on both what Tom and Andy said, and I'll kind of take it from the start. I'll do a little bit about beginning, middle, and end. And, at the beginning, obviously, you want to prepare well. You want to find out everything that you can about the topic of your story, the people that you're going to be interviewing. So it's it's not as though you're walking into something that's entirely strange. So you write out your list of questions. And at the start of an interview, I think it's a good idea to explain to your subject what you hope to cover in the story. If not, you're not going to give away the entire script, as it were. But by giving your interview subject a feel for what you're hoping to accomplish with the story, it will help them keep their responses in line and on track with where you're headed. During the interview, as Tom and Andy said, listen carefully. If your subject is talking too quickly, you can slow it down. You can just ask them to repeat that. Can you clarify? And remember too, with this whole clarification business, if something that that your interview subject is saying is not clear to you, then it is not going to be clear to your reader either. So you've got to make sure that you get them to clarify, to break it down, into the simplest possible terms. Ask for examples. I read a piece a week or two ago on the topic of farmland preservation, which is an issue that's been around probably for 30, 40 years or so, and it's been confusing people probably for just as long as the topic has existed, and what that story really missed, and leaves me still confused, is that there weren't any really good examples of how farmland preservation worked in this particular government jurisdiction that was being covered. And again, ask for an example, and then if you've got an example, then you can use that, weave it through your story, and make it that much better. When an unfamiliar name or an organization is mentioned during the course of the interview, again, this is an opportunity to slow it down. Ask your interview subject for the correct spelling. Ask for the contact information of that individual, of that organization, because it's likely to be another piece, another element that you can add to your story with some additional reporting. At the end of any interview, I usually go with two open-ended questions. And the first is there anything else that I should know that we haven't talked about yet? And again, this is an opportunity, just as using silence as a technique. You get your interview subject to hopefully come out with more information, possibly another angle or two for you to explore. The second question, somewhat related to that, is who else should I be talking to so that my story is more thorough, and get a couple of additional leads. And maybe those additional leads don't necessarily fit for this story, but they will help you on something else that along the road when you're doing something else. Now, finally, when you wrap it up, I believe it's a good idea to let your subject know roughly when your story is going to run, and then invite your subject to call or to email you with additional information if they come up with it prior to your deadline. So you're keeping that door open to get more information flowing to you before you finish writing. And at the same time, let your interview subject know that if you've got any questions, you are going to come back to them, so that they don't think that once they hang up the phone or close the door behind you, that the interview is over. So all of those things come together and will help you become better interviewers. Now, with that, let's open it up to questions. And as I said, this is not going to be a test for you, but let's hope that some of the questions that you ask show that you've learned a little something from listening to me. So go ahead. Anybody got any questions? Fire away. There's that 10 seconds of silence.
I think we're all going off mute. So I have a question. How do you approach a situation when someone doesn't really want to tell you something, and you're trying to get a statement, sort of you don't want to pin people to the ground. You don't want to sort of call them out in what you perceive as a lie. But how do you really get to the truth when someone doesn't want to tell you?
I guess one of my favorite stories, and Jim Gutman may very well remember this reporter. We had a guy named Joe Trento at the News Journal, and Trento did a lot of reporting on the CIA and the National Security Agency and all sorts of other organizations and spy operations. And one of his favorite lines, and I don't recommend it, but again, this is a good story. Is you'd hear him on the phone, in one of his, he said, "Well, you can tell me, or you can tell the grand jury," and that usually got them to give him at least a little bit more information.
How very subtle. I like that.
Joe Trento was not particularly subtle.
Well,
Yeah,
and I
but
was thinking, Rebecca, I mean, if you this could go several different ways, but if you know already, if you already have some facts at hand that would seem to be at odds with what the person is saying, then you can present those facts and say, well, I understand that, but given what you just said, how would you explain these statistics from here, or how would explain these things over here? So you're presenting them not with opinion, but you're presenting them with whatever facts you've been able to glean that might put what they're saying in somewhat of a different context.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing you can say, just make the case that this is a very important. I know this may be hard to talk about, but this is a very important subject for these and that reasons. And our readers really want to know or need to know what this is, what the answer to this is, or what the council is going to do, or why the council didn't do this, or why they voted on that. You can make the case as well. That's just in the public interest.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Andy, do you have anything to add? I see another question in the audience.
Well, just on that topic, I think sometimes it's important just to remind people that, look, you're doing your job as a journalist, and you want to make sure that people understand where you're coming from, what your intent is, why you did something. And it's important that we always give that person that chance to speak, whether it's uncomfortable or not. And sometimes you have to tell people, look, I know this is difficult and I don't enjoy asking this question, but I feel like in fairness, you needed an opportunity to address whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Joel, I know you have your hand up for a question. You want to unmute and ask it?
Yeah, I was wondering, I know several of you mentioned that you should ask clarifying questions. Do you recommend interrupting people to ask that clarifying question? Because I guess that's the way to speed people, or to slow people down. But
I would say don't interrupt them in the middle of a sentence, but even the most long-winded individual sometimes has to take a second or two to catch their breath, and that's usually the best time to do it. And don't interrupt. Just wait for that natural pause, and then if it's something that your subject happened to have said 30 seconds ago, you can go back to your head and say, "Hey, just a second ago, you said this. Could you clarify or explain that a little bit for me?"
Yeah, I agree with Larry on that. One of the things that I do on smaller points in interviews is if somebody says they had done something at a certain time or with someone and they don't mention specifics, I use a legal pad for notes most of the time when I'm doing my stories, not these little tiny notebooks. But over in the margin on the right, I might circle something and say, ask later. And then at the end of the interview, you can go back and say, hey, I want to clarify a couple of points just so I have my notes correct. And that's a good way to go back and do it.
And those clarifications are so important. I just want to second the point that Larry and Andy have both made. Larry, you made it most recently in terms of quotes. I can't tell you how many times over the years I would read a quote in a story from a student and I would say, what does this mean? And the reply, sadly, was often, well, I'm not sure, but that's what he said. That's exactly what he said. I have it on my tape recorder. Do you want to listen to the recording? I said, no, I don't want to listen to the recording. I want someone to tell me what the heck this really means. So you can't hide behind just, well, but that's what he or she said. I mean, you have to ask the clarifying question to get to the point, because if you don't understand it, as you said, Larry, you're never going to be able to explain it to the reader. It's just going to be this mysterious, head-scratchingly frustrating quote.
And the other point that Tom is getting at here, although it doesn't relate specifically to interviewing, is that there are going to be times when you are writing your story that a paraphrase is going to be much more helpful to the reader than the direct quote.
Exactly. But again, to paraphrase it, you got to understand it.
Yes, yes, that's true. Yes.
Absolutely. What other questions do people have? I know we're at 11:12 and we end somewhere between 10:15 and 10:30. So we have a little bit of time, but what do you guys want to know?
I have a
Hi.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. How do you deal with someone who overshares? Quite often I'm interviewing someone and I don't know if it's because I have a life coaching background and they're crying, they're telling me about their ex-husband. And I'm like, wait, I'm not really here for this. So how do you get someone back on track without breaking the trust and that built relationship?
I guess I would maybe go back and refer to my list of questions that I've prepared, and maybe you've got something on there that can guide your subject away from the track that she is on, and take her a little back a little bit closer to where you want to go. I can't give you a specific example here because I'm not quite sure about the context of a particular interview that you might be referring to. But if somebody is off talking about her kids and her family life, and you really want to talk about her childhood, well, find a way of steering it back into the direction. Okay, hey, so how does how does that relate to what you did when you were a kid, for example? But find a way of taking the subject back to the track that you want to put her on. Does that help? I hope.
Yes, thank you.
You got to be gentle with it.
Anything to add, Tom or Kathy?
Well, I was just thinking if it's really a subject that the interviewee is struggling with, and it's extremely important, you might also say, well, that's a very interesting point, or it's a very, I'm sure this is a very important thing for you. Can we save a little time at the end to talk about that? But the purpose of this story, which is running in tomorrow's paper or whatever, is this other thing. And I want to be sure you have enough time to express yourself and get in this story. And then let's save a little bit of time at the end and get back to this other thing and see if we can talk about possible solutions there. So you might try that as a tactic.
Or take it a step further and let your subject know that, hey, this is so interesting that it might be a topic for something that you would like to write in the future, but it might, that might not be until next month or whatever. But you've got today's deadline to deal with first.
Right.
There was someone else who was jumping in to ask a question. I didn't see who it was, but
Oh, yes, it's me. if an
Alexis, okay.
individual, yes, if an individual tells you beforehand that there are certain questions and topics that they don't want you to bring up, do you honor that?
This is a multi-point question, I think, isn't it? Let me start by saying, I would say, consider the subject and the source. So if you've got a private person maybe dealing with private matters, your respect is going to be much greater. And you might ask, why would you not want to cover that? And, so you have a better understanding of it. But I will tell you that if it's a politician, an elected official, or an appointed official, and they say they don't want to talk about it, tough. Don't let them go off their record. They can give you some background, perhaps, that might help you in your note taking. But you have to hold people accountable. So sometimes you just have to say respectfully, look, I'm here because I'm representing the people. I'm not being nosy. I'm not trying to pry. But the people who elected you, the people whose tax dollars support you, need an answer to these questions. So there's times when you have to be firm.
Absolutely. Agreed.
All right, so it sounds like there's just no avoiding hard questions if people are trying to take things off the table. It sounds like persistence, bring it back on, and bringing it home to our mission of ensuring that the public understands and knows what's going on are your best tactics.
And then again, as Andy points out, if you ask them why they don't want to discuss that particular topic, I mean, the response that they give you may give you an opening to tweak your phrasing and get them to open up on that particular subject. So, again, rather than just immediately agreeing to whatever preconditions they attempt to set, ask them about why and parry their responses, and perhaps you get them to move in the direction of giving you the content that you are looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the group? Well, I want to know what we should have asked. What question didn't get asked that we should have asked you guys?
There you go. That was one of mine.
Well done.
I try. Oh, and actually, Joel has another question, so you can all mull over what we should have asked, and I'll go back to Joel and he can ask his question.
I was kind of curious what to do when people are consistently not answering your questions, like swerving out of the way of them and this and that. Like, how do you tell them without telling them that they need to answer your question?
Well, I think you come to the point where you do tell them that. I appreciate your time, appreciate your answers here. And again, Andy's demarcation between public people and private people is worth keeping in mind in this also. But certainly if it's a public official, elected or appointed, and they're giving you non-answers, after you've gotten 2 or 3 of those, you need to frame a very direct question. Just say, yes, you give me all this information, but the original question stands, which you still haven't answered, and then you repeat the question. And then if you have to, then you can put in the story, ask the direct question why he or she wasn't responding. He or she said, quote, whatever it was.
And that's the ultimate response.
Yeah.
And you might even say to them, look, at this point, what I have to say is that you refuse to answer this question in my story.
Yeah.
And it's fair to do that. I think.
Absolutely.
I think my other bit of advice to you would be, there's a couple things. I mean, this is a life long topic, a career, that we all learn how to do these things. You may not know it from listening to these speakers here that a lot of journalists are shy people. I am essentially a very shy person. If I went to a party with no reason other than to attend, I'm apt to not talk to too many people. I may not even approach too many people in the room. But if you put a pen and a notebook in my hand, it helps me overcome that. I know why I'm there. It's an interesting crutch to get to know people and to ask questions, and take advantage of that is what I would always tell people. The other thing is that ask questions. Like, don't be afraid to ask questions. That's what we do, and I think a lot of times people are timid about asking something that may seem a little off the wall, or some perspective that you have on something that you would really like to clarify. Ask the questions. People appreciate that. I think once you approach people for interviews, they appreciate the fact that you're being curious, that you're maybe being a little nosy, and they'll tell you when you've gone too far. But don't be afraid to ask questions. I think those are two really good bits of advice that I've gotten through the years.
And again, going back to that and relating to what all of us have said about doing your homework, the more you know, or you think you might know about a topic because of your preliminary research, when you dig in like that and toss a question at your subject that they might not have expected, but it shows that you do have some familiarity or interest in the topic. It's going to get them to open up a little bit more. As we're wrapping this thing up, there's one other thing that seems to come up these days more and more often in interviewing, and I'm kind of curious in terms of the responses that some of you have gotten. Now you'll ask your interview subject something, and they'll respond with a pause, and then they'll say, "That's a really good question," and and then I'm kind of waiting for what that response is going to be, because was that a really good question because you have just fed into one of his or her talking points, or was it a really good question because you've just gotten into something that they don't ever want to talk about, and all of us, and they're going to spend the next 45 seconds dancing around looking for the non-denial, denial, whatever. I'm just kind of curious, if any of you have had that experience with that's a really good question response, and then what you've heard after that. Nobody's ever told you that?
I've gotten that. And for a long time, I always thought, oh, wow, I must be a great reporter because they like the question I just asked. So
Right, yeah.
I don't know, it fed my vanity a bit, and it still does. I like to hear it. But knowing that it is a tactic to stall for time, I've still gotten good answers from it because they do have to think about what they're saying next. So I don't think I've really been disappointed when I heard that phrase myself.
Okay.
But that might come down to how many or how few public officials that I'm interviewing at any given time.
I don't know if we have time for a little anecdote from earlier. I can share from early in my career. When I worked at Saratoga Springs, New York, and my beat was covering thoroughbred racing there for a month. And the biggest stars and names in the sport were there, particularly for the Traverse Stakes, the $1 million race. And my editor there assigned me to do a story on a trainer named Leroy Jolly, who was inducted into the Hall of Fame that very month while I was there. So I went out to the stables and tracked him down and started to talk to him and asked a couple questions. And Mr. Jolly was less than jolly to see me. He was walking horses, feeding horses, and had no problem walking horses directly at me to try to get me to leave because he seemed annoyed by my first few questions. I turned in a story about that experience, and my editor rightfully held it, told me it was terrible and that I should try again. Well, I was certainly mad about it. You know, being a 20-something, nobody should tell me what to do. But he gave me a little bit of advice that, you know, keep in mind, this is in the 1980s where we didn't have Google. So he said, you need to research this guy and go back and do it again because his career has been extraordinary. So I went to the local museum for thoroughbred racing, and the librarian there kindly gave me 2 boxes of material to look through. Here's where you can learn more about this gentleman. Well, that was a lot more effort than I thought that I would have ever put into a story, but I sat there and I read these stories. And so the next morning I go back out to the track and I said, hey, Mr. Jolly, I really apologize. I got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I really would like to know more about your effort going into this race and talk a little bit about why this horse may be the best one you've had, even better than the ones that he had before that I rattled off the names of. He said, give me a minute. And then we sat down on a bench and talked for an hour. So the lesson is don't go in like a goofball, you know, because you'll be treated like one. And so it was great advice, and it turned out to be a good experience for me.
Good story. Okay. I think we've pretty much covered everything. And Rebecca, do you see any more hands up, or are we about ready to give it a wrap?
We are ready to give it a wrap. So thank you all for joining us for Into the Newsroom's Effective Interviewing. Tom and Larry and Andy, that was, I think, a really exceptional discussion. And I feel like we all have gotten some good tips and tricks out of there. I hope Doc has been able to take some of that to his interview that he's going to right now. Next week, we'll be back in the saddle for our next Into the Newsroom session. And so I hope you'll join us for that. It is, I believe, actually, I'm not sure what it is, but we'll be back on Tuesday, and we'll have this recorded session available in MDDC's weekly planner. So thank you so much.
Great. And then 2 weeks from today, we will be having the next one sponsored by the Delaware Community Foundation. And we will be talking about preparing materials, your content for different media. And so we will have multiple media, actually, and we'll have Tom Byrne from Delaware Public Media, and Mark Eichman and Chris Barish from WHYY, Julie Zeglin from Technically, and they will be talking about the challenges of preparing content for both print, for broadcast, for online, having to essentially tell the same story, perhaps in 2 different ways for different media. So that's 2 weeks from today.
And next week, I've now double checked. It's Bring Data Stories to Life. So that's the third part in our series of working with data. So Alex Piles from the University of Maryland is going to help us sort of round out the discussion. So in our first session, Sean Mussenden showed you how to use Google Sheets. Then we had Adam Martin show us how to visualize that data with some free tools. And now Alex will share how to round out that story with real live people to make the data come alive. So join us for that next week. All right. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Great to be with
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.